Hi, okay, Eitan's also here. Okay, Levi, Yaakov, and YY somewhere out there. Okay, nice to see you all in some form. Can you hear me? Very good. Okay, thanks for the cooperation. Okay, fine. I'm going to recap on the assumption that maybe somebody out there might not have heard the first section of this. We're talking about we're trying to analyze Kiruv and with an eye towards honesty. I don't mean to imply that the people in this field are somehow disingenuine. I think that there's a genuine attempt to try to spread the beauty of Torah. But in our zeal to sometimes accomplish that task, sometimes we forget some of the other values and ideals that we strive for. And with an eye towards emes, we'll be considering this. If you recall, what was it, 2 weeks ago, we talked about a popular general approach in Kiruv. There are different versions of this, but in the version that I'm presenting, we presented 6 values that are presented as world values. We might qualify and say that they're really Western values that have been promulgated recently in the world. That even though they're in people's consciousness as somehow eternal values, indeed these are the exception to the rule. That the argument goes that through most of history, the world was barbaric. And that values, and here are the 6, the right to life, the right to a peaceful world. That means that war is something to be avoided at all costs. That all people, number 3, that all people should be treated equally and with dignity. Number 4, that everybody is entitled to an education, that literacy is a value. And number 5, all these, as we explained last time, really one flows from the other. That there should be a stable family life and the correlation between stability in the family and stability in society as being a given, as an axiom of a responsible society. And finally, we talked about number 6, that there should be social stability, there should be welfare, we should look out for one another. These to Jews sound axiomatic. We take such things for granted, and much of the world today takes these institutions for granted. And the argument goes, and I think we concluded last time with the quote from John Adams, and I'll quote it again because it's worth knowing, even if it's a familiar one. He says, "The Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations," at which point we slap our collective knee. Now, let's trace each of these 6 values, and I'm reviewing the presentation as it's often given. First, we present, as in the last episode, we present the fact that most of the world neglected these values, and now we're going to present something that for us, these are truisms that we take for granted, how each of these is found as a profound central value in the Torah in some shape or form. Number 1, the value of life. It's in the 6th of the Dibros of the statements, Lo sirtzach, not to murder, Uviarta hara mir kirbecha, that you should burn evil from your midst. That we know the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us saving one life is like you're saving an entire universe, or ultimately the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says that each person should say, Bishvili nivra haolam, for me, the world was created, underscoring the critical value that each of us has, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God puts us in this world for a unique purpose. And one who takes a life destroys a universe. Called me'avchicha tzoakim elai, as Shem rebukes the first murderer, Cain, that all of the blood in the awkward language of plural are now calling out to me, all the unborn descendants. Now that one life is gone, untold, numerous lives that could have come into existence will not see that. And we've always understood this. And as we contrasted last week, this was not understood in most of the world. Certainly the next logical idea is that we value peace, and that war is something to be avoided. We should dream of a world without war, without military fanfare, without, as Rambam says, paraphrasing as he concludes in Sefer Malachim, he says, in the final days there will be neither famine nor war, there'll be neither envy nor competition, good will flow in abundance, and all the delights will be freely available as dust. And these values have, interestingly, and we can consider together where some of these may have come from, but these values have trickled in and become the dominant values, Baruch Hashem, in the world today. So you don't have to look much further to this question, this dubious body that calls itself the United Nations, that has not been the best friend of the Jews since its inception. But the United Nations has something that's quite telling. In their headquarters, anybody been to the United Nations? You could not. So I prefer an interactive share, but I understand that we're not allowed to do that until the very end. You can give me thumbs up or thumbs down if you go. The understood. So the UN doesn't have much in terms of iconography, but if you visit the New York headquarters of the United Nations, you'll find what's called prominently the Isaiah Wall. Anybody see it before? The Isaiah Wall, and what is written on the Isaiah Wall in English? The pasuk in Yeshaya, Lo yisagoi el goy charev lo yilmedu od milchama, that nation will not lift sword against nation. They will no longer study warfare. And this is the rallying cry today of the nations, something that, interestingly, its source is in the Bible, is in the Tanakh itself. Number 3, justice for all people is an essential value. You don't have to look further than the 19th chapter of Sefer Vayikra of Leviticus to find all the basic rules of justice. Tzedek tirdof, we say elsewhere, but this appears throughout the Torah, throughout the rabbinic writings, that we understand that justice has to be meted out fairly. Doesn't matter what your status in society, doesn't matter how rich you are, doesn't matter if you're the king has to carry a Sefer Torah wherever he goes, because he's also under God's dominion and has to answer to a higher being. And the king is beholden to the Sanhedrin and had all kinds of restrictions. We understand that a king had to be married and had to have children too, because a parent with children tends to be more sensitive to life and pauses before meting out a death sentence. Excuse me, not the king. This is the Sanhedrin. Excuse me, the Sanhedrin has this as a prerequisite. We have to have integrity, and that everybody's entitled to a fair trial, that everybody's equal before the law. We have numerous examples of this in the halacha. One litigant is not allowed to present his case while the other litigant is not present, because maybe it's not a fair discussion. The judges have to sit and equally, with impartiality, have to hear both sides. And this, together with many other examples, shows this value. Number 4, got to learn. A tzaddik can't be a bor, can't be an am haaretz, can't be an ignoramus. And indeed, Jews have embraced the learning ethos for all of our history. And one can find that Jews have had a high literacy throughout their history. Now, some of this we might consider to be sometimes misplaced, because today a lot of the Jewish zeal for learning is outside the realm of Torah, but it runs strong in our genes. It runs in our history. The estimated student percentage in all universities in America, at least, is somewhere between 10 and 25% of the student body is Jewish. And consider that, crunch the numbers. If we consider that the world's population is 2.3 billion Christian and 1.6 billion Muslim, and even though these are wildly flawed statistics, but some less than 13 million Jews, these are disproportionate to our numbers, to say the least. The faculty in the universities is also the Jews. There's even larger representation of Jews, reflecting this desire to know, to understand. Without knowledge, we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. We're doomed to not understand the world we're living in. We have this value from the get-go. Men, particularly, are obligated from a young age, if they're capable of learning Torah, that we understand the takana of Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla, the decree of Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla, when literacy was starting to decline in the difficult days of the Second Temple period. So the rabbis, Chazal, respond by decreeing that teachers have to be appointed in every province. There should be, what do they call this nowadays? No, there should be possibility for schooling for anybody who wants it. That was an innovation of the Jewish society. And if you recall, and this is actually worthwhile, the one disadvantage of doing this class in two different parts, you have to have good recall on this one, is in the rest of the world, this was just not a given. In fact, if you remember, the rulers of the world were quite content to keep the public in the dark, illiterate, ignorant, docile, and easily governed. And we're not afraid of that. We're not afraid of providing an education, especially when the Torah education will make people better, is the general assumption. The world exists, finally, we understand, Chazal teach us that because of the breadth of children studying. This is a value that's a Jewish value. Today, it's increasingly a world value. Number 5, family morality. The Torah is the book of family morality. That from the very beginning, a man, Adam, is commanded that a son should leave his parents, cling to his wife, become one. They are, in fact, a married couple. A man and a woman are two halves of a whole. Marriage is a legally binding relationship. It's based on mutual love and respect. Torah prohibits other variations. It's narrow, as the world would accuse it of being today, and it's blessedly, proudly narrow, because it understands that the family unit is the key to sustaining a civilization. There is no other example of a civilization that's lasted like Am Yisrael, like the Jewish people, and clearly the linchpin is the family. There is a reason why the woman is specifically charged with adultery. The women are seen as the source of family values, and so if she's not going to be loyal to her husband, so then of course the man that she committed adultery with is also in trouble. But the woman is seen as paramount in the stability of the family. Somebody quoted this, and I couldn't resist, so I'm going to quote it as well. They quoted Dennis Prager, who has a way with aphorisms. Prager says, "The Torah revolution forced the male Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, into the marital bottle. It ensured that intimacy and matters of intimacy no longer dominated society." And indeed, that's the case. We understand what Freud calls repression, we might refer to as self-restraint and discipline, to enable us to focus on higher values, on moral values. And indeed, the self-discipline that we've gotten through monogamy, through marriage, is a revolution. And it paved the way for the moral basis of modern civilization. When you have stable families, you're more capable of doing good, of performing social acts of kindness. And this is a value that's been inculcated and is maintained by Jews. And of course, in the secular presentation, they'll emphasize not just the kehila, the community system, and how in every Jewish community, you had every institution taking care of all of the life cycle needs, from birth to marriage, to dealing with to bereavement and death, soup kitchens and Bikur Cholim societies. Virtually everything that a person could need was always available in a religious context. And when Jews started leaving that context, the urge for chesed, olam chesed yibana, did not leave them. Today, some of the statistics that we can cite, the UJA is considered, I guess I'm relying on somebody else's authority, but this sounds correct, as the third largest charity in the United States, and therefore in the entire world. And consider the UJA, United Jewish Appeal, this is remarkable, only 2% of the United States population is Jewish. We don't have to look further than the 19th chapter again of Sefer Vayikra. We do not stand idly by the blood of our neighbor. We love the widow, and we take care of the widow and the orphan and the stranger, the ger. We take care of the poor. Sur merav aseh tov, we turn from evil and proactively seek goodness. These days, the Aseret Yemei Tshuva that we find ourselves in, Ben Kesel Asor, between the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we look for opportunities. And it's in us, it's our lifeblood doing chesed, looking for opportunities to try to give. Most societies, if you ask them to define what makes a good person, most societies in the world will say very minimalist kind of ideas. They'll say, well, we don't do bad, we pay our taxes, I've never been in jail before, or other sort of understatement kind of declarations. We don't consider that's good enough. The Jews are the first ever, and of course it's not the Jews, it's the Torah, to worry about animal rights. Animal rights, Sar Bali Chaim, is a value by us, because animals, they're not humans, but they're creatures. They're part of Hashem's Bria. We take care of them. We care for the environment. We have to take care of the world we're living in, particularly Eretz Yisrael. From the tradition of social justice, the world borrows. As Thomas Huxley said, the Bible is the Magna Carta of the poor and the oppressed. And indeed, virtually every architect of modern culture eventually, inevitably quotes the Bible, quotes the Tanakh to justify their own ethical outlook. It's around this point in the presentation, once the audience has been warmed up and I think reasonably persuaded that the Torah has quite a moral vision, around this time, one tends to hear a little more discussion of Hashem and the source of all the goodness. We mentioned last week, and clearly you can hear in my tone that there's, maybe I have a resistance to this, talking and leading by talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu could be seen as a turnoff on the Kiruv circuit, on the outreach circuit, and you may come off sounding too much like one of those evangelical radio hosts. So they tend to spare too much discussion on the source of everything, on the creator of the universe. But around this time, you've made a reasonable case, and we can start pointing to the fact that Hashem, organized religion, has actually made people profoundly moral in the world. In fact, religion and Judaism, Torah, is the greatest civilizing agent in the world. Man is created in the image of God. We have a soul. It's a piece of the infinite. These are such obvious ideas to us, but we have to stop and cherish these ideas and recognize what the Torah gave us, and recognizing the godless of being a part of this world, part of this people. Since, of course, every human being has a piece of Hashem, we're also like Hashem. We have that same innate desire to give, to do good, to do chesed. And since we're like Hashem, every person should be treated as a holy being. Amos, the Navi says, aren't we all his children? If, of course, we're like Hashem, we're obligated to act like Hashem. V'alachta b'drochav, we read it just a few weeks ago in the Torah portion. You should walk in his ways. Hu rachum, Hashem is compassionate. Afata, so you too should be compassionate. Avram Avinu, our first role model, he leads the way. He spreads the idea of Hashem being this singular source of morality. Without Hashem, there is no morality in the world. The other ideas, the pagan gods, what we suffer from today, moral relativism. There is no God. There is nothing. The amorality that comes out of this thinking. We don't believe that this is correct. There's Hashem, and therefore there's one standard of right and wrong, of good and evil. And we're alone in declaring this against the world. Avram stood against the world, as the Meiri says. Some of you in history might remember this. The Meiri says that Avram was Makarev. He brought close to Hashem over half of his generation with these words, with these ideas. So it's good for Kiruv now today. Good then, good today, good for us as well. And we often stand against the world. That's our theme song. I picked up one of the quotations. It's a good one from 1984, George Orwell. As Winston Smith, the protagonist, is being tortured, his torturer says that he's just a minority, and so what right does he have to go against the mighty state? And Winston tells his torturer, just because you're a minority of one doesn't make you wrong. It's our theme song. Jews are chosen not for privilege, but for responsibility. We have a mission in this world. We're supposed to be a light unto the nations. We're to perfect the world. And the world has recognized this, often begrudgingly, and today increasingly we see this. Dio Cassius was the Roman historian. He's the major source of the discussion of the Bar Kokhba period. So he certainly had a reason to have a chip on his shoulders against the Jews. We were the uppity rebels. We actually seem to give the Romans a run for their money. So he has no vested interest in speaking our praise, but he does. He says the Jews are distinguished for revering only one God. He recognized this. Consider this in contrast with the Roman society of its day. Roman had not been won over by any monotheism, no Christianity, nothing. The Romans had in excess of 30,000 gods. It's ironic too, because according to Roman linguistics, if a Roman converted to Judaism, and they did in that period in droves, he was tried for what they called atheism. Now, it's true, the Jews have led a revolution. The Rambam discusses how the other religions, with all of their many flaws of Christianity and Muslim and Islam, but these revolutions have taken millions, billions over the ages of pagan, amoral people and made them at least semi-monotheists, if not more, who are certainly much closer to the Jewish view, meaning we see as we study history, which I always say you should do in depth, that people are coming closer to the Torah view. In fact, some argue that the greatest purveyor of Jewish ideas is not religion at all, but it's modern liberal democracy. There's a point there. I think it's an exaggeration, but certainly the fact that the liberal democracy is dominant, that the media channels the ideals of liberal democracy. And of course, liberal democracy is predicated. So many of its values are predicated on Torah values, as we've been discussing. And therefore, not coincidentally, all the founding fathers of America, it was considered the great light of the liberal democracies, all of them, every single one of them, somebody could write a dissertation on this, were fueled by the ideas in the Torah, in the Bible. I'll quote another one. We started with John Adams. How about some FDR, a mild anti-Semite, as we know, but in his address to a youth group in 1940, this is how he had it. In teaching this democratic faith to American children, we need sustaining, buttressing aid of those great ethical religious teachings which are the heritage of our modern civilization. For not upon strength nor upon power, but upon the Spirit of God shall our democracy be founded. Anybody recognize the pasuk? It was Zechariah there. We read it some weeks ago in the Haftarah. So you have it from FDR, and there's an admission here that the Jews gave us morality. And thus, in one shape or another, wraps up the presentation, and it's powerful. And we can go home satisfied, and I guess you could turn off your video screens at this stage, but don't, please. We're just getting started. We need to do some fine tuning. And I have to be specific here. The presentation is wonderful, period, full stop. And it's worthy of considering. That's why I presented it as I did. The fact that I'm going to do a little deconstructing doesn't take away from its power. But we need also to understand how to present things properly. So here are my issues with the presentation that I just completed. Number one, so you got some really nice pithy quotes from presidents, from John Adams, from FDR, and they focus frequently at what the Jews brought the world, and I've already expressed some hesitation and uneasiness with this emphasis on the Jews. Of course, we're the purveyors of Hashem's words, but they're all Hashem's words, and this is a distortion. The minute you de-emphasize Hashem and you focus on the greatness of the Jewish people, there can be, especially if you're a Jewish presenter, as many of you are going to be spokespeople for Klal Yisrael, there's a sense that you guys are kind of taking a lot of pride for yourselves, aren't you? A certain chauvinism, a Jewish chauvinism at bay here, that we're taking credit constantly for all the good stuff in the world. And it's where credit is due, but it doesn't sound right, and it's not right. We're not taking credit. It's all from Hashem, because the minute you focus on the divine, that it's all from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so then I'm not trying to win a religious debate. My team is better than your team. All of this flows naturally. These ideas emerge as dominant and universal because they're from the creator of the universe who loves all of his creation. I always feel this way whenever I hit a sweet spot when I'm speaking, and a lot of my colleagues agree with this, that sometimes I'm not the one who's doing the talking. Somehow the words are just coming into my mouth, but that it's not me. It's all from Hashem, all the good stuff. The mistakes and the stuttering and whatever else you might criticize, that's all me. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu is excellent. Actually, somebody is on speaker. Probably the presentation better to turn that off or keep it a little quiet. So my first problem, I think I'll summarize and just say that we should emphasize Hashem always and not be embarrassed about that. And if you're going to turn off people, let them be turned off. People will come around. Everybody has, there's no atheist in a foxhole, a different argument for a different discussion, but everybody has this in them to acknowledge the godless, the greatness of Hashem. And we shouldn't confuse the message with the messenger. There's one messenger, capital M. Number two, it's similar but a different point. Emphasizing all these non-Jews and giving us all this credit leaves me very uneasy. We need non-Jews. Paul Johnson gave us one of our more quotable selections in the first half of this presentation. We need Paul Johnson to tell us that the Torah has a relevant message. And when people do quote Johnson, so much so that I actually asked Shaila and was told to read it. That's one of my areas, history, and he has a unique vision of history. And last year I read his book, The History of the Jews, cover to cover. And I must say, as I quoted last week, and I can quote him frequently, he's eloquent on many points. He also subscribes to ideas that we would define as kfira, as heretical, and very problematic. And if you're not a discerning reader, and even if you are a discerning reader, frankly, you could miss it. You might be influenced by the wrong ideas. He's not a source of Torah ideas. So for such a person, look, I was very surprised. You can find his book in Jewish bookstores around the world, and down in Mea Shearim, they sell it, and it was recommended to me by a mentor. Something about that leaves me a little uneasy. Do we need to constantly be looking to something like Paul Johnson to validate something that the Torah itself gives us and validates on its own? Number 3. Not all the ideas that we're discussing here, how do we put this gently, are correct. They're distortions. Anybody listening with a certain keen critical ear knows what I'm talking about. So let's just say, for example, the idea of giving and tzedakah. So you have to be politically correct on the circuit, right? So you have to say that we give to Jews and non-Jews. And we do, somewhat. But you know Hilchos tzedakah, right? Tzedakah is primarily to Jews. There is an idea of giving to non-Jews, but that's a Mishnah in Gittin. It's a different discussion altogether. It has to do with Derech Shalom, and it's not the same. It's not at all equivalent. Priority is placed on the Jews, and even for that matter on Shomer Shabbos Jews. That's not politically correct. But I'm going to get more politically incorrect now. We're not egalitarian. Now I have to say, at every point I'm going to bring up now, I'm treading in delicate area here, but every one of these points can be discussed and explained, and I think made a very compelling, reasonable case can be made on each of these points. Why indeed there is a logic and a justice in the fact that we give to Jews before we give to non-Jews. We do give to non-Jews, but it's not a high priority. This can be discussed. But in presenting our bill of goods, we have a tendency to try to brush over these ideas. There are many ideas that don't fit in the modern zeitgeist. Should we lie about them? You have to say that somebody could make a claim, and many do, that the Torah is alternately misogynist, racist, hierarchical, and they have a host of other complaints, and each one of them is a file. Each one of them is another discussion. I think all of them could be answered and answered very well. What we have to say about all of this is the Torah's view is simply radically different than the current Western view. There is a paradigm shift. There is a totally different way of looking at things that requires some sophistication. And Kiruv audiences don't give you the time necessarily to go through all of that. But on the other hand, neither should we gloss over the issues and try to present a case that's not really accurate. Really, to understand many of these ideas, one requires complete immersion, as many of you had when you came for a year or two or more there to Israel, to fully grasp a lot of the depth of the Torah. My question with this, of course, if you bring people close, if you makarev people to Torah on false pretenses, on distortions, you promise something that doesn't in fact exist, won't people later on, when they discover the truth, and the Torah is an open book, we encourage everybody to learn it for themselves, won't they feel betrayed? And conversely, shouldn't we be proud of the Torah, and shouldn't we understand since it's Hashem's word, we don't have to start apologizing for it? Inevitably, when you have this kind of a presentation, you run into this murky area. Number 4, the Torah, as we just said, stands on its own. We don't look for anybody else's legitimization. But now consider the whole presentation we've been talking about. Take a step back and try to think about the whole implication of what we said. The fact that we present what's maybe considered the best of these Western values, of these non-Jewish values, as a shiny reflection of the Torah, we're sort of implying that the Torah should be judged in light of others' values. And if others sort of say, good going Jews, that's like a point for us. And if they, therefore the corollary would be if they criticize and they say, this doesn't fit our values, then maybe we should be upset. We actually think it's the other way around. Everything in the world, all morality, so-called morality, has to stand in favor of the Torah. We have to look at it through the prism of Torah. And if it doesn't meet the Torah's standards, then there's something wrong with the morality, not the other way around. We say b'chukosayim lo silechu, not to walk in the statutes of the non-Jews. That's an issa d'oraisa. It's a Torah prohibition. Because we believe, what's underscoring all of this, that the Torah is the complete guide to holiness, to ethics, to everything. Number 5, Hashem, we know his chasima, mystical idea, hard for us to understand this. His signature, as it were, is the word emes, the word that frames the aleph base. Emes, we know, truth, yesh lo raglayim, sheker ein lo raglayim, I'll translate. So the word emes, if you make spongy versions of the Hebrew letters, you can take the aleph mem taf and stand them up and prop them up, and they stand on their own. And the opposite idea, sheker, shin, kuf, resh, they all wobble over. The spongy versions can't stand up. And it's a cute idea, but it's a profound idea. Because in this concept, we understand that truth wins out. That if people are brought in through some pretext, through some distortion, and sometimes through a lie, eventually that's going to come around. People are going to recognize that. There's a problem. We talked about this when I ran a kiruv training program for people going into rabbinic work on university campuses. But sometimes you could take people and bring them close under false pretenses, and later when they discover some of the truths are not what they thought, they could be what Chazal are concerned about, toa al rishonos. They could start questioning, what was this all about? We really should have bitachon. Hashem in his wisdom knows what he's doing, and our job should be role models and leave Hashem and his Torah to do the magical tricks and do all the rest, and not distort in the least. I'll say in conclusion before we'll open things to questions. Perfecting the world certainly is a basic responsibility of all Jews. We hope that it's infectious. We hope that it spreads to all humanity. That's certainly our mission. We understand that the Torah is the only guide for realizing the potential in ourselves and in the world. Presidents from John Adams to FDR, it's true, and they're correct to cite the Bible as the source of all goodness. That does not mean that they get it. How could they understand all the many nuances of the Torah? They can quote a certain piece, but it's out of context. And we know the Torah's got a written and an oral component, and they need the one needs the other. It's up to us as Jews to learn meticulously and accurately, to be masters of all the accessible wisdom that we find in the Torah, to find its subtler depth, and to, as best we can, be precise teachers of all the sublime messages in the Torah. And that's the way we become a Mamleches Kohanim and a Goy Kadosh. That's my reflection on a little bit of Kiruv. Is there anything I thought? And then I have to figure out how to turn this on. Are you vocal? Can you go live? All right, forgive me. Hi, okay, Ephraim, do you have anything?
Not yet.
Okay, fine.
I just joined.
Yeah, I know you did. It's unfair. Okay. Well, if nobody has anything, I'll keep this for a minute if anybody has. I enjoy the discussion if you have, but not if it's forced. Fine. Okay. Good to see you all. Keep these races. Although I have to say this, the format is terribly unfair. I would love to catch up with everybody. I see all these great faces. Okay.
Rabbi, hearing you makes me want to come back to Israel.
Good. Bezras Hashem, you should come soon.
Second that, and I miss you, Rabbi.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, okay.
Wow. Hi. Okay. Good to see you all.
Likewise.
Gemar Chasima Tova to everybody.